All right, everyone, this is Nathan Lindorf with Rational Independent. We are mixing it up today. I'm trying out a new feature. We're calling this the Breakdown. And this is where we take a clip from a popular podcast or a YouTube video, particularly as it discusses something with political and cultural commentary. And we identify conversational tricks and rhetorical tactics that the left often uses to make their points in a political conversation that are very difficult to spot when you're in the moment. But if we take a conversation and we break it down, we can show some of the things that are being done that you otherwise might not notice. The goal, as always, is to improve our ability to reason through our own positions, to articulate those positions to other people, and to encourage other people to articulate their own deeply held positions as well, and then to do our best to advocate for our thoughts and our opinions and our beliefs, and by so doing, participate in the marketplace of ideas and help to improve the quality of our civil society. Because the simple truth is, if we lose the ability to articulate and debate political positions, then we will lose our civil society and descend into violence. Most of the videos that I've culled so far come from the PBD podcast, Patrick Bet-David. He runs Valuetainment, very successful businessman in insurance, runs a great broadcast company, modern media company. He hires a bunch of talent. He's building a brand. He's very methodical in what he does. I like the way that he thinks. I like the way that he speaks. He's politically fairly independent. He kind of is in that Joe Rogan space as far as he is able to attract guests from all sides of the political issues that are at play in our society, which is a rare talent. Most of the time you get people who are siloed. Maybe they're a little too harsh, or maybe they're a little too ideologically bound themselves. But it's all too often that true, deep leftist thinkers don't want to come on anything but friendly territory. And somehow he's able to get these leftist guests, and he's able to give them a chance to speak their piece. Now, he doesn't necessarily agree with them. He pushes back. It's not a softball interview, but he allows them to make their point, and he lets it stand. And it's a dynamic that works. So we're going to dig into this. We'll be looking at both left and right. But in my experience, these tricks will come up most often for people on the left, partly because it's a leftist principle to not be principle-based. In other words, if you look at the left as people who are pushing for authoritarian centralized government, which is, broadly speaking, how I view it, then you're going to see people who are power-centered, not principle-centered. You're going to see people who believe the ends justify the means. So rather than, as an example, a conversation I was listening to earlier, rather than the principle of private property being important, they'll make the case or the argument that says, hey, listen, if the end effect of a 100% tax rate is better than what you would get if you owned your own, all of your income and you were taxed to 0%, wouldn't you rather have it that way? Would you be willing to accept centralized government power if it gave you what you wanted, or maybe even more than you could get from your income? Would you accept a 100% tax rate? And that's an argument that comes from the perspective of, we don't really care about the principle of private property, personal stewardship, the right of a citizen to try something and fail, to make foolish choices with their money. All of these things are part of a free society. And they're trying to instead say those principles are not as important as the end of a utopian society where you get everything you want through government intervention. So wouldn't you rather have that? Wouldn't you rather have that end? And we can just kind of gloss over the means of how we get there. That's a common conversational tactic. And that's the difference, I think, between the left and the right. So the conversation for today is between PBD and Neil deGrasse Tyson. So many three-name people, but we'll make it work. This is a recent conversation from 7 months ago. They are discussing the COVID vaccines in general, but it gets a little heated, and it's primarily about the COVID vaccine. New technology, doing my best. We're going to see how this goes.
From what we knew at the beginning of COVID to what we know today, what do we know about the vaccine today that we didn't know while we were all testing it in America, taking it? What have we learned now?
What do you mean testing it?
So this is my fourth listen to this, and I actually missed a layer here, but we all learn. So Patrick Bet-David, his initial position is he's saying, what have we learned about the COVID vaccine now that we didn't know when we chose to roll it out in a rush during the height of the pandemic? That is a really good conversational prompt. It's a great interview question because it gives a chance for his guest to, in a very broad way, discuss whatever's most important to him and riff on things and go ahead, go after it. Great interview question. However, you'll notice, and this is something that happens more than you might think, but it does happen. Sometimes if you're in a position where you're debating with a leftist, they are not interested in answering the question you ask. Instead, they'll look for a misstatement or they'll look for some form of a rhetorical advantage where they think they can jump on it and gain an advantage in the conversation. In this instance, Neil deGrasse Tyson jumps on the idea that Patrick Bet-David is saying where we were testing it while we were taking it.
On America, there were tests before it was released.
9 months is not a long time to test.
No, but it was tested.
Yeah, but 9 months, the average is 30. The average is 5 to 10 years. I mean, 9 months is not enough.
Okay, so you have to say,
test.
no, you have to ask.
To articulate what we're talking about, Neil deGrasse Tyson immediately responds with, oh, we tested it. In other words, he's responding as if PBD had said, we didn't test it. Fair. Miscommunication. Perhaps we misunderstood. PBD jumps in and says, no, I'm talking my concern. Again, he's arguing in good faith, I would say, and he's trying to clarify what he sees as a miscommunication. And this is often the case where when left and right speak, the left presents confusion or presents, they ascribe to you a position you didn't take. And when the right hears that and understands that, they say, oh, that's not my position, which means you must have misunderstood me. So let me clarify. Except if the left is not arguing in good faith, they understood your position. They just either don't agree with it, they think it's dangerous, or they want to shut you down in some way. Hence the deployment of rhetorical tricks.
Hold on. It was tested in trials, okay? By the way, I'm not claiming to be the expert on all of this. I read all the same things you have, but I'm a scientist, so I read it as a scientist, okay?
This, first off, Neil deGrasse Tyson is no dummy, but this is a very clever rhetorical trick that he just employed, if you paid attention. Here's what he just did. He said, first, at the beginning of this debate, okay, that we're carving out, this adversarial conversation, I'm going to give myself proactively a place to retreat to. If this conversation goes badly, if I lose this conversation, I have a place to retreat to because I just said, this isn't my specialty. This isn't what my area of focus has been. So he's not undermining his own credibility. He even sounds a little humble. Again, he's a gifted communicator. But rhetorically, what he's done is he's given himself a place to retreat to. If it goes badly, he can say, listen, perhaps I misspoke. This isn't my area of expertise. And he can undercut the damage to his reputation because after all, this isn't his area of expertise. But in the same breath, he says, but I'm a scientist, so I interact with this topic as a scientist, which is an appeal to authority. It's a logical fallacy that says, you should believe me because I'm an expert. So he has simultaneously claimed expertise and a lack of expertise in the same sentence. That is a brilliant, condensed way to both give him something that he can bludgeon his opponent with, compared to PBD, who's a layman, a businessman. I'm a scientist, so I have more expertise than you, therefore trust my authority. But in case I lose, I'm not really an authority. Very clever. 10 out of 10.
Okay? They were trials. That's what the point of phase 1, 2, 3 trials are all about. They are tested enough to get data on how to then advise the larger population. Yes, it was tested. For you to say it wasn't tested is a gap between.
He's now directly ascribing to PBD a position he didn't take. At no point did PBD make the position and say, we didn't even bother testing COVID. We didn't even bother testing the vaccine. We just rolled it out irresponsibly. No, he even clarified his initial statement because he kind of used a shorthand reference, and then he offered more clarification. He said, my concern is that we did not deploy long-term tests. The average in the medical industry for a new vaccine from beginning of development to deployment in the broad population is 5 to 10 years. PBD is absolutely right on that. That is the average, historically speaking, for other vaccines. That is not even close to the timeline that was done here. It was deployed and tested and released rapidly. Essentially, societal compromise was reached in which we said, enough testing, roll it out. The long-term testing will just have to happen naturally as we've rolled this out in the population. In other words, he's saying we're doing long-term testing concurrently with deploying it in the population. That's the factual position that PBD said. But Neil deGrasse Tyson has now ascribed to him the position that PBD says there was no testing.
Between your awareness and understanding how things work and what actually happened. It was tested. If you want it to be tested on millions of people instead of thousands, you can put in for that.
Here's another position. Maybe your concern is the sample size wasn't big enough. Maybe your concern was you think it should be millions instead of thousands in these studies. Again, I hate to belabor the point. That's not what he said. That's not his opponent's position. This is gaslighting, straight and simple. It's a very effective rhetorical trick because it forces the other person to either continually defend and clarify and explain, or it forces them to defend a position they don't even hold, or it makes the other person feel crazy at the end of the conversation if they're not good at keeping track of, in abstract, what's my position, what did I say, if they're not very disciplined in their speech, etc. It could really twist you up. It's a sign that you're not arguing in good faith.
You can say, I don't want this unless it's millions. That's okay.
Totally fine with me.
Okay.
I'm okay with that.
That's fine. So based on that, do you say, let's keep testing it while the virus keeps spreading? Okay? Right. So this is the contest between the information you have available to you at that moment and what's going on outside the lab.
Now, he's very smarmy right here, and makes me want to. I would not react calmly if someone was to treat me this way. Why does he get away with it? I would argue he gets away with it because he's arguing from a position of authority. Here, I'm a scientist. I'm trained in these matters. I have expertise in this area. Let me explain to you how this works. Let me teach you how to do a cost-benefit analysis. He says to the successful insurance businessman, pretty sure PBD knows how to do cost-benefit analysis among populations. It's almost like he made a lot of money doing that. Anyway, let's see where it goes.
People are dying. Hospitals are becoming overloaded. So, do you say we have good data on the 1,000? It's not yet at 1 million in case you wanted 1 million.
And again, let's reiterate, because that's your position. You wanted 1 million, even though that's nothing PBD said at all, not even close.
Are you going to say, let's still do it let's wait another 6 months so we get another 1 million in here? Will you do that as a public health professional?
No,
This is important. I'm going to pause right here because it's easy to miss, but he says it. It's real because he's going to shift in a second. He's positing this hypothetical specifically, explicitly from the position of, is that the decision you would make as a public health professional? In other words, assume that you are some kind of epidemiologist with the CDC overseeing the deployment of the testing and deployment of these drugs as a matter of public policy. In other words, implicating state action, government action. Is that the cost-benefit analysis you would make?
I would have said, allow the individual to still have a choice that's okay with 1,000 instead of a few million. Leave the person have the choice.
And that's the key. Oftentimes in conversations, sometimes, and credit to PBD, and in a way to Neil deGrasse Tyson, when you're having an argument with someone in good faith that does not agree with you, the most important thing you can do is, as quickly as possible, particularly, hopefully, before tempers get flared, try and identify the core disagreement. Where is the root of the issue? If you argue about all these branching ideas, you can yell at each other for hours and get nowhere. You know, think about this. If you have a couple that's been married 20 years, they might have an argument that covers kids and laundry and the budget and your mother-in-law and your snoring and whatever. And if you really boil down to, maybe it's, hey, since you took that new job and you've been out of town more, I don't feel as supported at home and it's wearing me down. And I'm worried I'm not gonna be able to take care of the kids without your support. That's a productive conversation that you can have. That's something that you can negotiate on and come to a conclusion and a decision that works for both of you. But if you spend all your time arguing about your tangential issues, you'll never get to that core. So credit to them in this conversation. They reached this core disagreement in less than 2 minutes from the start of the clip. Good for them. Here's the core disagreement. All of the scientific principle is fine. And they, by and large, if you look at it objectively, they're in agreement. Okay. No one is saying we should not have responsible scientific inquiry, discovery, deployment of all these amazing drugs, all of the reasons why it can help in a crisis. No one wants millions of people to die. None of that. Here's the core of it. One party believes that the individual should be able to voluntarily and should have the responsibility to make their own risk assessment for themselves and their family and make the choice about the vaccine based on their own personal choice. The other side says, generally you can do that, but in this case, if you make a decision we don't like, we're gonna force you to make the right decision. And the right decision is our decision. We're gonna override your personal choice. So here we are at this core. Now, people arguing in good faith, once they identify that core issue, we'll then discuss whether or not that core issue can be managed, whether or not that can be adapted or changed. That's what the conversation becomes about. If you're arguing with someone who's not talking in good faith, who's more interested in winning the conversation than they are in than finding true common ground or resolving a deep issue, they are going to try and use rhetorical tricks to skate around that issue, to argue a different position, either take a different position themselves or ascribe a different position to you or straight up gaslight you or 1,001 other ways. So let's see where these things go from here. PBD initially said, what do we know now that we didn't know then? Neil deGrasse Tyson said, let's talk about this imaginary concern that you think we didn't test it and that you would only be comfortable if we tested it with millions of people before deploying it to the public. PBD clarifies and says, that's not my concern. My concern is we didn't do long-term testing, and that raises questions for me. And I'm concerned that even without that long-term testing, the government still employed measures of force to override individual bodily autonomy. Let's see what Neil deGrasse Tyson says.
Not force him to take it or else you're going to get out of the Marines, and you've been doing this for 14 years. Not force him to take it or else you have to quit your job as a nurse.
There's a public
it's
health
force versus
there's a
choice.
There's a public health contract that you have signed implicitly as a citizen of a country where...
This is very important because this is something that people who argue based on power as opposed to principle, they will appeal to your ideals. They will appeal to principles that you espouse because people don't want to feel like a hypocrite. They don't want to feel like they have a lack of integrity. And so they will ascribe to you and say, if you don't agree with my position, it's because you have a lack of integrity. It's because you're a hypocrite. So what he just did is he said, if you don't agree that the government should mandate vaccines, then you aren't a patriot. then you aren't a responsible citizen. Then you lack integrity or compassion for your fellow men. You must be selfish and blinded and, apply all the aspersions you like. That's the argument that he responds to. That is a low down dirty trick. But he's clever because he doesn't say it right out. But if you think through the emotion of what he's presenting, that's what he's presenting.
In part, we depend on each other for health, our wealth, our security, and the like. And that contract is, in the best scientific evidence available at the time, if you do not get vaccinated, you will put other people in this organization at risk, and that organization does not want to take that risk. So you do not have this job anymore if you decline it.
Notice, I brought this up earlier. Notice, he started by saying, is this the decision you make as a public health administrator? But that's where it implicates force. PBD mentions force is my concern, government mandated force. Neil deGrasse Tyson responds with, the business you work for might make the choice to not have the risk of having you as an employee if you don't take the vaccine. So they might fire you for that. That's not what happened. What happened is the government mandated that businesses enforce this. The government was the driving factor to mandate vaccination adoption by employees. That's government force, but that's not what Neil deGrasse Tyson says. He's created a straw man where he says, well, it's totally reasonable for a private market actor to decide in their own risk analysis to not have you as an employee if you won't get vaccinated. But that is just gaslighting. That's not what's driving both the concern that he's overtly stated or the historical record of what actually happened.
So, with any public health decision, there has to be a consequence to you not participating in that social contract. Is it your job? In some cases, it was. But no, we're not going to have the army bust into your home and force a needle into your shoulder.
I think it was pretty close to that.
That's not going to happen.
We pretty much did that.
Well, only put your job at risk, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, just your job. Just the way you feed your family. Just your livelihood. It's not like that's important to people's emotional health. It's not like, men commit suicide when they're unable to feed their families. That never happens. No, it's just your job. Sickening.
67% of Americans took the COVID. That's force. That's not a choice. That's a lot of force and coercing and pushing going on. But you can't go to the school unless you're vaccinated against mumps. I think that's bullshit.
That's a different country.
Yeah, but
okay, what you want a country?
No, America is supposed to be the one that offers the most freedom. That's what America is supposed to be.
Okay, so watch.
So for example, if you use that argument, somebody may say, well, freedom of choice, I want to choose what I want to do with the body. You're right.
What body?
If you want to get an abortion, it's your choice.
Your own body.
If you want to get an abortion, get an abortion.
You notice how he was looking to jump in? And he was like, oh, what body? What body? I think he saw a line of attack depending on what he meant by that, and he was wanting him to clarify so he could jump on it. Not that he wanted to listen to what Neil deGrasse Tyson was saying, not what PBD was saying, or listen to the rationale behind his well thought out and articulated position, but find a rhetorical misstatement or something that he can do to undermine it.
If I want to get the vaccine, I get to choose. So you can't force, if I can't force you to get an abortion, you shouldn't be able to force me to get
Because it's not about you.
It's interesting that people on the left will appeal the principle when convenient for them, my body, my choice, when it comes to their preferred position of abortion, saying that you should not, as the government, have the power to mandate a medical procedure on a particular individual. As a citizen, they have the right to make that choice for their own body. But the moment that principle becomes inconvenient and people who don't want a vaccine says, my body, my choice. That principle's out the door. Now, you have to do it. You have to do it. My body, my choice doesn't apply.
It's about people you interact with, and that's the social contract of public health.
We don't even know if the vaccine worked or not at the time.
Yes, that's what the trials are, dude. That's why these trials. Are you missing data out there?
But let me ask you a question. Are we saying only one type of scientists are right?
No, we're saying that the system in place.
The 16,000 that signed that.
No. The system in place to test vaccines. There's an entire system that's in place. That with review boards and all of it.
And the average.
That's in place. Now what you can say is, I have a better idea than all these review boards and all these agencies and the CDC. I have a better idea. Here's what you should do. And that would have made everything better.
Once again, and that we're going to unpack this a little bit and we're going to wrap it up here. But once again, Neil deGrasse Tyson is ascribing a position to PBD that he did not take. He's saying, you can choose to abandon the scientific method if you want and offer something totally different. But that means that, okay, so there's layers here. Just got to unpack it a little bit. All right. Right at the very beginning, Patrick Bet-David made the statement that said, basically, because of the emergency, we did short-term testing and then we deployed it to people, contrary to the standard medical practice for vaccine deployment. We shortened the testing period and basically said, okay, we're going to do the long-term testing concurrent with deployment, but we're going to go ahead because of the crisis and roll it out now. And Patrick Bet-David said, let's have a conversation about what we might have learned from the fact that we rolled this out without doing the long-term testing. Neil deGrasse Tyson, said, due to the emergency, we had to roll it out. Okay. What that means is he's claiming that the crisis caused a shortening of the review period, caused a change in the deployment schedule. He argued that that was a good and valid reason to do that. That's an acceptable thing to say. That's totally reasonable. Sometimes in emergency, you don't have the luxury of doing all of the steps in your process. Sometimes you have to jump right to the conclusion, okay? But less than 5 minutes later, he's now making the case that if you don't agree with the forced deployment of a vaccine to the broad population that has not undergone long-term testing, that you want to abandon the scientific method and the systems that support that scientific method, the review boards, the peer review process, the publishing schedule, the CDC, all of these institutional protections that enable us to roll out consistently good scientific products, that his own position, Neil deGrasse Tyson's position, is that we skipped a lot of that because of the crisis. And then now he's turning around and saying, if you don't agree with us skipping it, you must want to abolish the scientific establishment and come up with something new. In other words, if you really look at it, he is taking Patrick Bet-David's position that the scientific method is good, but that because of a crisis, we skipped the long-term testing and did it concurrent with deployment. That's PBD's initial position. He's taking that and now making it his and forcing Patrick Bet-David to try and defend the position that's not his position, defend the position that if he doesn't agree with Neil deGrasse Tyson, he must be someone who believes in magical thinking and unicorn farts and not the scientific method. We are 5 minutes into a 25-minute video. I like these. This is kind of fun. Hopefully the audio worked this time. And if you like it, let me know and we'll do some more of these. But at the end of the day, I think this kind of analysis is important. So let me know what you think in the comments. This has been The Breakdown with The Rational Independent. Good luck out there. All right, everyone, carrying on where we left off, continuing our analysis of the conversation between Neil deGrasse Tyson and Patrick Bet-David. Let's get right into it.
In a case where you can contaminate someone else, it's not about you. It's about the collective
You're assuming
health.
Something I want to point out that I notice, and I'm not an expert on haptics or facial expressions, body language, that sort of thing, but Neil deGrasse Tyson is very good at making eye contact, connecting with his audience, discussing, being engaged, and he gets very enthusiastic about nerdy information. That's one of the things that makes him a good communicator. And when he's sharing something that he's genuinely excited about, he's engaged with the person. He is locked eyes. He is, he's enthusiastic. But look at the language that he's showing here. He's not making eye contact with Patrick Bet-David when he's saying these things, when he's making his point. It's almost like he has to separate himself from what he's saying. I'm going to wind back 10 seconds. Let's look at it again.
You can put forth that idea. But what I'm saying is, in a case where you can contaminate someone else, it's not about you.
That whole thing, he's not looking at the camera and he's not looking at Patrick Bet-David, which to a gifted communicator, to someone who knows what he's doing, means he's not talking to the audience and he's not talking to his interviewer. He is taking his mind to an abstract place.
It's about the collective.
You're assuming.
And he's still doing it until PBD starts talking, and then he looks.
Health.
You're assuming because somebody can take the vaccine, won't get COVID, which, by the way, I don't need to play the clips for you to see it, where everybody said, hey, if you get it, you're not going to get, if you take the vaccine, you're not going to get a Rachel Maddow, Joe Biden. I can give you Fauci. I can give you, and you've seen these clips before. It's not like you've never seen it before.
Yeah, what happened
They were wrong.
Hold on. So.
One of the signs of someone who's not really trying to get at the truth is that they won't give ground even when you make a good point. Patrick Bet-David is not speculating. What he's doing is bringing up that a variety of people who had the responsibility to be spokesmen during the COVID crisis made the case publicly. They said, if you get the vaccine, you won't get COVID. And then later went on the record on video saying, I was wrong because the science proved out that it may have reduced your risk or reduced your severity, but it did not grant immunity in the sense that there are many, many people who got the vaccine and in the future tested positive for COVID. There shouldn't be a problem with saying, you're right, mistakes were made, or they were wrong. Not even a mistake, because it could be based on the best evidence at that time that it was going to grant immunity and make it so that you were a terminus for infection, that once you were vaccinated, that it couldn't flow through you anymore. You were immune and you couldn't pass it on. That was the case that was being made early on. You can be mistaken. The process of scientific discovery is to create a hypothesis and observe the results of that hypothesis. The hypothesis being put forth by the scientific community that PBD is referencing is, if you take the vaccine, you won't get COVID yourself and you won't be able to transmit it on to someone else. That is a hypothesis. Then we prove it in the lab of lived experience and we realize that hypothesis was false. It was proved false. That should be okay. If you are pursuing scientific inquiry, that should be a pleasing result at a certain level, because a conclusive dispositive result is useful scientific information, but it's not politically useful if your goal is to present some kind of political messaging or corrupt or subvert the scientific process to a political end. Political truth does not allow for this kind of genuine mistake. If Neil deGrasse Tyson is being genuine, he should say, yeah, they were wrong. We found out they were wrong and science improved because of it. Let's see what he says.
The strain evolved, okay? So that the vaccine that prevented you from catching COVID was tuned to the variant of COVID at the time the vaccine was designed, okay? over time, there were variants that arose. The vaccine provided partial protection against the new variants, enough to keep you from dying statistically, and to basically keep you out of the hospital, allowing other people with more severe problems to get the hospital attention they required. And so then they would develop a subsequent, the booster and a subsequent mixture of the vaccine. This is what happens every year with a flu shot. They look at how the flu has evolved from one season to the next. And what's fortunate is Australia tends to get the variant of flu before we do, because they get their winter in our summer. And then, so we study that, have a forward projection for it. So these annual flu shots are precisely out of the same idea of how this occurs.
How long have those been?
This is something I might call chaff, conversational chaff. PBD makes a succinct point. People who were spokesmen during the COVID crisis made a claim and were later proved and admitted that that claim was false, in the sense that it was incorrect. They were wrong. Instead of responding directly and saying, no, they weren't wrong, because you can't argue the facts. The historical record is black and white clear. You can't argue this point on the fact. But it's not politically useful for a leftist to agree with something that damages the left's political operation. So we choose a third option, which is, we'll call it chaff. He throws out that viruses mutate, that vaccines tend to be most effective towards the form of the virus that they were tuned to. Okay. Then he starts talking about flu shots and flu vaccines. Then he starts talking about how winter and summer are different, and so we can use the Australian winter season to help inform our vaccine decisions for the following winter. Okay. All of that doesn't answer the question. All of that is basically filibustering. It's basically saying, hey, would you like to chase off down any of these tangents I'm offering? Because none of them are as damaging as the question that you raise. So let's see if PBD takes the bait or keeps us on point.
Tested though for years. COVID vaccine hasn't been tested for it. It was something we just came out. But
I don't know what point you're making, other than it was tested. You might
9 months is not enough.
You might prefer. No, it's not a matter of time. It's a matter of how many. Yes, time matters, but.
And of course, here we have something beautiful. One, he's still not making eye contact. Two, he is getting kind of bombastic. He's raising the tone of his voice. He's speaking faster, and he's pushing back a little bit, going, I don't know even what point you're making. You're being nonsensical here. And then PBD says, well, here's my point. It was not tested long term. So PBD says, my concern, it wasn't tested because it wasn't tested long term. And then Neil deGrasse Tyson says, yes, it was tested, not long term. It's not a matter of time. It's a matter of, I'm assuming he's going to say sample size. He realizes that that's not a very good answer, that's going to get him trouble later in the conversation. And he reverts back and says, oh, let me take that claim back. Time does matter, but ... And what happens when you have a conversation like this is that you end up, one, he's just verbally taken both sides of a position. He's tried to correct himself. If you're arguing in good faith, you're allowed to correct yourself if you slip up. But what he's really trying to do is he's trying to win the argument. He's trying to win the conversation. And again, one of the things I want to point out, the beginning of this conversation, if you know the PBD podcast at all, it's not a very combative podcast. It's just not. It's a fairly open forum. And the question being asked was, what do we know now as compared to what we knew in the middle of the crisis? And there are 100 different ways that you can have a conversation about that that's not combative, that's not a win-lose scenario. There's a bunch of different ways you can take it. Now, maybe he's been under pressure, Neil deGrasse Tyson, in other formats. Maybe he's frustrated. Maybe he's, feeling a little defensive here. But he immediately turns this into a contest and seizes words that PBD is saying and is trying to push for a particular point. And it looks like he's doing it again here.
The number of people is paramount. That's the most important thing. Okay, you don't test it on 10 people. You test it on as many people as you can.
Sure.
And I think it was thousands, but
is it fair
don't
to
quote
say
me.
that some of the side effects we may not know for 5, 10, 15, 20 years? You can't, they can't.
The reason why I suspect a political motive in the way Neil deGrasse Tyson is approaching this conversation is there's no scientific reason to not just say, of course. When you have something new that has never been studied long term, you cannot definitively say what the side effects might be 10 or 15 years down the line. For instance, you don't know, now nobody knows, and I'm not going all tinfoil hat, I'm just throwing out a random possibility. If you get the vaccine as a child and it changes something in the way your body eventually goes through puberty, maybe it affects your future fertility. Maybe it affects your future heart function or lung capacity, some of the things we've seen implicated. Maybe it increases your chance of getting a blood disorder or whatever. I'm not a scientist, okay? Just pay attention. The point is, we can't know what the long-term side effects could be of this because there has not been enough time passing. That is a scientifically safe thing to say, but it's not a politically safe thing to say.
Say, we know 100% the side effects 10 years from now. How are you going to know that?
Yeah, okay. So, no, of course, we can't know
So
that.
then all I'm saying is...
Watch.
Hey! He realizes there's nowhere to go, so he agrees. And this is one of the interesting things that you will find when you're talking with leftists. They will agree and then immediately go back on the offensive, or they will agree and then immediately go back on what they just said, or in some way turn it back into a combative conversation. So let's see where it goes.
Can't know that.
Okay.
But watch. So I have a whole chapter called Risk and Reward in the book, which tries to sensitize people to when they make a decision, what kind of risk are they absorbing relative to what they're rejecting, okay? And we're not very good at that, at probability and statistics or analyzing. That's why TV commercials trying to sell you a product don't just show you data. They show a person speaking of the effectiveness of the product. A single person. I lost 50 pounds. The testimony of an individual should be irrelevant to you relative to the entire set of people who have done it. And you want to look at those statistics, but we're not good at that. And advertisers know that. So they show the testimony of an individual, which is hugely potent in a civilization where we don't think statistically, we think about eyewitness testimony on something. And somehow that is raised to a very high level of influence on our decisions. What I'm saying is, you're not your decision point is not, I'm not going to take the virus because 5 years, 10 years, I don't know what effect it's going to have.
Some may, though. Some may not be comfortable with
Let me
that.
finish the sentence. Okay? So you can say, I don't want to take the virus because 5 or 10 years from now, there could be a side effect that we don't see.
Which is a possibility.
Hold on. I'm trying to make a statistical point here, okay? If you say, I don't want to take the virus because it hasn't been tested for 5 years and there could be some long-term side effect that worries me, okay? In that same moment, there's the risk factor of you getting COVID.
Sure.
Okay? Unvaccinated. At one point, 87% of everyone dying in the hospital of COVID was unvaccinated. Okay. So your risk choice is, I'm not going to take it because maybe somewhere down the line something will happen and we don't know what that is, or I will risk getting COVID. And if I get COVID, depending on your age and other things, there's a 3% chance of me dying in the hospital. That's your choice. Yes. Yes, but what I see people doing is they focus on one thing, and that's the foundation of their decision, rather than the other chance. And what happens if you get COVID? Now you get long COVID. Now you can have a taste buds for 2 years or whatever it is for long COVID.
Yeah.
You're on a ventilator in the hospital, possibly dying. Like what? Where is the? So I looked every day, once a week.
He took a while to make that point, but let's try and distill down the point that he's trying to make in this conversation. PBD is saying, shouldn't a person be able to make that choice of whether or not they want to run the risk of an unknown side effect of the vaccine, or if they want to run the risk for COVID? And fundamentally, that's an individual decision. Neil deGrasse Tyson is saying, yes, that's your decision, but because human beings are bad at risk analysis, you should not make that decision. You're making it wrong. And the establishment knows better. He gets into this a little bit later, but we're going to get a little sneak peek. The establishment knows better how to measure this risk, and therefore we should be able to force you to make the right decision. We can pretend up front that you're free to make that choice. But if you don't make the choice that we like, then we are going to apply ever increasing degrees of pressure until you make the choice that we want you to make, which is not a free society, which is not a society with freedom of speech, with freedom of thought. It's not the American society that's compatible with the Constitution. You cannot build a centralized authority that has the ability to compel these kinds of personal decisions and have that centralized authority be in line with the Constitution. That they are antithetical to each other. I think it's worth saying, we're now 10 minutes into the video, so we're not going to go any further. We're just going to wrap up and conclude. I'm going to do this in 5-minute chunks till we get through the whole video. If you're arguing in good faith, you should be able to articulate both sides of the position. You should be able to be firmly convinced of your own side, but you should be able to offer to the satisfaction of the person you're discussing with it, that you now understand their position and why they have made it. The challenge is Neil deGrasse Tyson as an analog for leftist argumentation is that they are more interested in the end results of the conversation than they are in the process of the conversation. Here's what I mean by that. One, this is he's clearly on a book tour. So that's what prompts a lot of these interviews is they'll go out and they'll try and promote their book. Fantastic. Hey, if you're a thinker and a writer, share your thoughts in the marketplace of ideas. Okay, go ahead, promote. But when you promote it, don't be afraid to be challenged. Patrick Bet-David is challenging him. He's challenging the logic of his position. I think Patrick Bet-David understands Neil deGrasse Tyson's position. I'm not sure that the same is true in reverse. Because what Neil deGrasse Tyson is saying, as someone who has been captured by scientism, by the scientific establishment, is that he is willing to abandon scientific principles, which is the objective pursuit of truth through rigorous analytical study and experimentation. He's willing to abandon those if he achieves the end that he wants. Now, his end might be a good end, or at least good on the surface. For instance, it sounds like he wants people to make better decisions when it comes to weighing risks, pros and cons. He wrote a whole chapter about it in his book, which I haven't read. That's a good idea. That's part of growing up, being an adult, being able to weigh the pros and cons of a decision. That's why 18-year-olds go cliff diving into the water, and far fewer 60-year-olds do the same thing. Because as you get older, you get a little wiser, you realize the risk-reward ratio doesn't make sense, and you say, I'm not going to do that. Okay? That is a laudable goal. However, it appears that he is willing to embrace a centralized, statist, violence if necessary authority in order to force you to make the right choices. And that is completely unacceptable. That is dangerous. and it's fundamentally anti-scientific. That's why it's so difficult for him to engage in what he claimed earlier, is that he's a trained scientist, to engage as a scientist on this topic, because it is things that should be scientifically sound are politically dangerous to the left. So he can't admit those things. We'll carry on as we go forward, but this was part 2. We'll see part 3 in a bit. Cheers. Welcome everyone, this is Nathan Lindorf with The Rational Independent. Had a video corruption issue with part 3, so we're re-recording. This is part 3 of Neil deGrasse Tyson on Patrick Bet-David's podcast, the PBD podcast, discussing vaccines, particularly COVID vaccines, and it's frankly coming back relevant again as we see a rise in news articles discussing reintroducing mask mandates, discussing COVID case rates, etc. So let's get into it.
Once a week, I looked at the statistics. How many people are getting COVID? What's the rate? What's the rate of hospitalization? What's the rate of deaths? Where is it by state?
I had to look at it. My board forced me to look. We're in the business that we have to
they
look at.
should,
Yeah, of course.
because it's data.
Yeah, I agree.
On risk factors.
The risk of
One thing I want to point out, and we've talked a little bit about this already, but it's important to kind of stay on it. When the left thinks that the science is in their favor, they will take this hardline approach of it's data. We got to follow the data. We got to look at what science is telling us and then do what the data tells us. Let's just put a pin in that for now.
people's lives.
Okay,
for
so
sure.
nothing is ever zero risk. Yeah, there's a risk that you'll grow a third arm in 10 years because the virus mutates within you.
Should the individual not have the right to say, I don't want to take it because
You don't have the right to contaminate someone else. So
the body language of that statement is amazing to me. It is so blasé. He doesn't even look at PBD when he says it. He points at him and just gestures and states something just as a flat authority. Let's hear that one more time.
yes. Yeah, there's a risk that you'll grow a third arm in 10 years because the virus mutates within you.
Should the individual not have the right to say, I don't want to take it because
You don't have the right to contaminate someone else.
You don't have the right to contaminate someone else. Think about the implication of that statement. That is someone speaking from a perspective of governmental authority, because he's advocating for government control of public behavior through these vaccine mandates. And he's saying that if there is a risk that your action could infect someone else, the government must take that risk away. So Micro with Dirty Jobs is a great thinker. I love the way that he looks at the world. And one of the things that he gets after is this idea of safetyism, the idea of safety first. Safety should not be first. If you live in a society where safety is first, you're going to live in a police state. You're going to put security above everything else, and that's going to completely rob you of most of the freedoms that make life worth living. Safety should not be first. Safety should probably be third, but that's a conversation for another day. That sentence that he's saying right there, that Neil deGrasse Tyson is saying, you do not have the right to make your own choice over your own body if you might infect someone else. That is a safety first mentality and enforced through government authority. That is an atrocious statement to take. Let's see if he can back it up.
So if you don't want to get shot,
Who says that though? But who says that?
it's a social contract in a modern civilization.
I don't have
public health.
I don't have the right to contaminate someone else. What do you mean? Like, so what do I do? Stay home all day?
Yeah, or go to the beach. Yeah, you stay away from other old people who
but
you stay away from people who are
but
immune compromised.
So Neil, so for me, I'm asking you because I want to know how you process this as a guy that's well-read, smart.
I process the data, and the data.
We didn't have enough data though.
No,
we didn't have enough data
at any given moment.
Yeah.
PBD is basically saying, listen, how do you as a scientist approach this? And he falls back on that old adage, I follow the data. I think he follows the data insofar as it leads him to politically convenient conclusions. But I can point out, and will through this conversation, several places in which he is ignoring data that is inconvenient to his political outlook, his purpose.
Yeah.
there's data for you to make a decision at any given moment.
Sure.
The data is constantly getting better and better.
Yeah.
All right. So, all right, at any given moment, you say to yourself, okay, what happens to me if I get COVID? There's a chance I'll get long COVID. I'm certainly out for at least a week. And there's a chance I'll be hospitalized. And there's a chance I'll die.
Mm-hmm.
I take the vaccine. It mitigates this, basically entirely removing the chance that I'm going to die, essentially, at my age group. And I will accept the risk that in 5 years I'll grow a third arm. That's the kind of decision making that I make.
So he just laid out a cost-benefit analysis the way he sees it. He lays out the potential downsides on one action and downsides on the other and says, this is the decision that I make. But what he's really saying, if you look at the way he's forming his arguments, is this is the appropriate decision that everybody should make. In other words, when PBD says, as an individual, I want to make the choice that I don't want the potential risks of the vaccine, Neil deGrasse Tyson is saying, that's the wrong kind of thinking. You've run your risk-benefit analysis. You've run that incorrectly. Run it again. And if you don't come to the right conclusion, then we're going to force you to do it our way.
Now, that's just for me. But on top of that, if my workplace says, we don't want you coming in unless you are vaccinated and you might lose your job, I would say, why? Oh, because you could contaminate someone else, introducing a problem in their own health profile.
Totally valid if you're making the argument that businesses as private entities should be able to set the terms of employment within their business. And I would argue that this applies specifically to new employment contracts. In other words, what he's saying is businesses should be able to decide, we don't want you in the office or interfacing with customers, etc., if you're not vaccinated. However, there's a thorny legal issue where they say, we're going to unilaterally change that policy for all current employees. We're going to change the terms of employment without getting people to sign an updated contract, without getting people to agree to this. We're just going to mandate it. However, the thing that's important that we're leaving out here is that Neil deGrasse Tyson is presenting this hypothetical, this idea of risk to your employment, as if the businesses are driving this mandate decision. But the simple truth, historically, is that it was not the businesses that were driving that. It was the federal government. The federal government essentially forced businesses to mandate to their employees. So it's a weird end run around the Constitution. There's a bunch of things that the federal government is not allowed to do. And what they've been trying to do in the modern world is to say, oh, we're not doing it. We're just instructing or twisting the arms or pressuring or whatever some private party proxies to do it. So we're not wiretapping. We're not recording your text conversations, but your phone company is. And so if we get a warrant, then we can get access to that information and the conversations that you had. Oh, we're not forcing you to take this vaccine. We're forcing your company to force you to take this vaccine. Oh, we're not censoring free speech. We're just having regular conversations with Facebook and Twitter and the other big players in the social media space, letting them know that there are these problematic users that are saying things that are politically sensitive and probably not appropriate, and we'll call it misinformation, and then they're the ones that ban you. We're not allowed to ban you, but our proxies are. It's a very legally shaky proposition when you really put the screws to it. But from a surface level perspective, it gives just enough deniability that in the public discourse, this is why I say, as a scientist, he should pay attention to data and details. And then he presents this situation incorrectly. In other words, he's either being disingenuous, or he's being, at this point, willfully ignorant. To present the idea of workplace vaccine mandates as if the workplaces are the ones driving those mandates means he's either incredibly ignorant, which I don't think he is. I think he's a smart guy, or he's intentionally misrepresenting the facts of what happened in the historical record in order to leave you with the wrong impression. That's what happens when someone gaslights. That's what happens when someone is arguing from bad faith. They're twisting facts. And once you twist the facts, it becomes easier to twist the logic. Let's go on a little further.
That's the public contract. That's why workers wash their hands in the restaurant bathrooms by law. Yes, they're required to do so because you don't want poop germs in your dinner that they're preparing. Because our evidence showed that that's one of the greatest places you can spread disease is in a restaurant with a central kitchen. So this is the now you want a world where you can do whatever you want and have it influence other people.
I'm not saying that.
So that's a beautiful collection of sentences. And for two reasons. Let's break it down a little further. Last sentence first. He is recasting PBD's position to say he wants a world where he can do whatever he wants as an individual, no matter how it affects other people. That is a straw man. That is a case of taking your opponent's position, stretching it out to the absurd, and then pointing and saying, that's absurd. We can't do that. That's not an accurate restatement of what PBD is saying. But it's a classic tactic when you're debating and you're not acting in good faith to misrepresent intentionally, repeatedly, your opponent's position in order to make their position seem less sound, seem more ridiculous. The other thing that's impressive in just these couple of sentences is that he just likened government mandates, because again, he's talking about by law controlling behavior for the sake of public health. And what he's saying is the government is equally within its rights to institute food handling guidelines and to institute licensure of restaurants and the way food is handled and prepared in order to keep people safe and healthy, and all of the science associated with that and the way to manage the food supplies presented to people and prevent the unnecessary spread of disease. That we're able to, that the government is valid in doing all of that, and equally valid, call it a slippery slope, go all the way down to the other end of the spectrum. By the same reason, it is equally valid to have the government mandate that either you put something in your body that is an experimental medicine, or you're not allowed to work. That's why the growth of government power is so dangerous. That's why when conservatives push back on just a little bit of government control, just a new element of regulation, it's real reasonable. We're just going to go after this one little thing. Except that give it a few years, and now they're going after more. Give it a few decades, and now they're going after everything. If the government is allowed to mandate the medicine that you have to take in order to be a functioning member of society, what can't they do? If they are allowed to create circumstances where your employment and therefore the food that your children eat, the shelter that you live within, is contingent on you obeying government mandates about what you do with your body, what medicines you take, what behaviors you engage in, how are we not adopting the Chinese social credit score system, where the government gets to control your access to transportation, to jobs, to money, to food, to everything based on how well you obey the regime? That's the logical progression that we're going down unless we get this to stop.
You kind of are.
I'm not saying that. All I'm saying is the following. Like, okay, for example, statistics. Have you seen the documentary Died Suddenly? Have you looked at it?
No, I haven't.
Okay.
Well,
This is a bit of a longer point. I'm going to let it run for a bit, and then we're going to wrap up.
It's an
where's it?
interesting one. It's on. I don't know where it's at. You can find it
I'll go
somewhere
watch it.
online. Yeah,
Okay. Mhm.
It's got 30 million views. I think it's worth watching. Actually, would be curious to know what you say about it once you watch it.
Mhm.
The statistic then showed, like pre-COVID, 29 people, athletes in Europe died suddenly from heart failure. Pre-COVID, pre-taking the mRNA vaccine. Okay, post-taking the mRNA vaccine last year, 1,500 people suddenly had heart failures in Europe, and 2/3 died. That's documented. That's not like it's a hypothetical, right? Okay, you read statistics like that, then one has the right to
But
say,
just to be careful, you have to be careful how you speak information. So you
Suddenly, he's careful about being meticulous and making sure that we don't overstate something. We're careful how we speak information, says the guy who's been gaslighting and misstating information the whole conversation.
are describing two events. Okay, you're describing events that had a temporal relationship. Okay, before you've established a causal relationship. Just be clear that that's
100%. I'm not doing that. All I'm doing is the following. Here's all I'm doing. If somebody all of a sudden starts having a breakout, okay,
a breakout of women.
meaning their skin starts breaking out. You're 26 years old. You never had a breakout. All of a sudden, you start breaking out. And the doctor says, listen, man, what have you been doing differently? Well, listen, for the first time in my life, 6 weeks ago, I started doing DECA, steroids. Well, okay, that's why
It
implicates it, right? Okay. Hey, if somebody all of a sudden, is having a hard time sleeping at night, I'm having a very hard time. So let's watch your diet. Well, then they notice at 10:30 at night, you're having iced tea and, lemonade, and you added with this. Well, listen, if we've been doing it for 6 weeks, that's why you're having a hard time. Just drop that. Don't drink that after 2 o'clock. I'm just making, saying, but all I'm saying is, what I want to know is I want to put everything on the table versus saying, no, there's one thing we can't put on the table, and that's the cause of the vaccine.
We're going to break it right there, and this is going to be where we're going to end our part for this section. So PBD is making a very simple, straightforward point. He's saying that the authorities, the medical establishment, the scientific establishment, the political establishment, the authorities, as it's come to discussing the COVID vaccine, have taken the position to say, you are not allowed to even discuss the possibility that the COVID vaccine had deleterious side effects, had other things that were happening that were not intended, that were harmful. That's not even allowed to be part of the conversation, to the point where people who mentioned these things would be banned, to the point where there's a political commentary show that I follow that quoted what the CDC had said 2 weeks before, and they were banned because the establishment had decided that that CDC statement was no longer up-to-date information. So quoting the medical establishment within the context of this conversation was enough to get that show taken off the internet. That's crazy. And it's interesting to me, the idea that there are harms related to these high-level athletes is an interesting scientific factor and one worth exploring, because I think there's a little bit of meat to that. That is likely a circumstance that we need to weigh the risks of pros and cons. If you're in a tranche of the population where you are very low risk for COVID, i.e., you're in your mid-20s, you are very physically fit, you are slender, you have no comorbidities, are we still going to mandate that you take a vaccine that appears to disproportionately harm people in your demographic? That is a worthwhile public policy conversation to have. As we go on into the next part, we'll see Neil deGrasse Tyson is not interested in having that conversation or even taking it seriously. So we'll dig into that a little further as we go along. Thank you all for your time and your attention. This concludes part 3. 2 more parts, and then we'll wrap this whole thing up. Good luck out there. All right, good morning, everyone. This is Nathan Lindorf with The Rational Independent. Last lap. We are going to close out this video analysis. One final part will be a little longer than the others, and then we'll stitch it all together. Thank you all for your patience. Enjoy. Once again, this is Patrick Bet-David interviewing Neil deGrasse Tyson, and they're discussing COVID vaccines and, more importantly, government policies around COVID vaccines, communication, freedom of speech, that sort of thing.
A breakout, all of a sudden you start breaking out. And the doctor says, listen, man, what have you been doing differently? Well, listen, for the first time in my life, 6 weeks ago, I started doing DECA, steroids. Well, okay, that's why it implicates it, right? Okay. Hey, if somebody all of a sudden, is having a hard time sleeping at night, Yeah, man, I'm having a very hard time. So let's watch your diet. Well, then they notice at 10:30 at night, you're having iced tea and, lemonade, and you add it with this. Well, listen, if we've been doing it for 6 weeks, that's why you're having a hard time. Just drop that. Don't drink that after 2 o'clock. I'm just making, saying, but all I'm saying is, what I want to know is I want to put everything on the table versus saying, no, 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 there's one thing we can't put on the table, and that's the cause of the vaccine.
So Patrick Bet-David, I love him because he speaks in paragraphs, but he's laying out a simple case, and fundamental to this whole conversation is that he lays out an excellent case that's persuasive to a layman, to a layperson, to a non-expert. However, that's not persuasive to the expert class, which scientists hold themselves to have a measure of expertise. They rely on that scientific authority in conversation and how they view the world. So Patrick Bet-David is saying, listen, I'm a grown-up, I'm an adult, I'm a businessman, I'm a part of this society, and I would like to analyze the risks associated with the COVID-19 vaccine and see if there are potential downsides to taking the vaccine. Let's look at all the data. Let's analyze it. Let's understand it. Let's look at the global picture. Even if it's a kooky idea, let's discuss it. Because even if it's kooky and we discuss it, that discussion is going to lead us to conclude it's kooky, and therefore we disregard it. Or if it's got some merit, maybe that helps everybody. This is the basic idea of a free exchange of ideas, the marketplace, to enable every participant in the marketplace to offer their best ideas, their best reasoning, their most persuasive arguments to try and sway public opinion. I think that's critical to civil society. I think it's more important than scientific expertise. However, Neil deGrasse Tyson does not agree. And throughout this conversation, he's been arguing from a position of scientists are better at rationally understanding cost-benefit analysis. And so if the scientists tell you that they've run the analysis and this is the benefit, then you need to just listen to them and do what they say. If they tell you, don't entertain that notion, it's dangerous misinformation, and if enough people believe it, it's going to undercut our efforts to heal and save the population as a whole. Now, they might be right or they might be wrong on the facts, on the veracity of their statements. That's something that can and should be observed. However, the argument is not without merit. Before we understood cholera ravaged whole cities, whole areas. Basically, it's because it's water-based infection. And so anywhere that water supply was infected, everyone who drank from that water would deal with cholera. Science helped us understand that vector of transmission and helped to change human behavior on a large enough scale to protect us from that disease. And thankfully, cholera is no longer a major threat because of that understanding and because, in a way, that training of the human population. So I'm not saying the argument of expertise is without merit, but science and the pursuit of scientific truth is about testing. It's about observation. It is about embracing the rigorous analysis of the actual results of your actions. So a scientist trying to persuade a population in a third world country with very little scientific understanding how they get infected with cholera, he doesn't do himself any favors by arguing with the local witch doctor that the witch doctor is saying it's an evil spirit, and so we need to pray to ward off the evil spirit, or do a ritual, burn incense or whatever. Non-scientific hocus pocus. The scientist should be able to argue effectively enough that the people turn from their superstitious thoughts and embrace the effectiveness of scientific teaching. That's not what's happening with COVID. With COVID, science has basically said anything that contradicts our current opinion, our current understanding, is not allowed in the marketplace of ideas. We're not going to have any counter arguments because counter arguments are dangerous. That's the sign of someone who doesn't want true scientific analysis of their behavior. Because science should be double blind, should be randomized. Science should achieve the same result, regardless of the biases of the humans involved. That's the reason we train people to have this expertise, is to achieve these results that are repeatable, reliable, consistent, and able to move us ahead as a people. But the medical administration and the institutional authorities surrounding COVID, and more importantly, the conversation around COVID, were acting like they had something to hide. They were acting like in the Wizard of Oz. Don't worry about the man behind the curtain. There's stuff going on here that we don't want you to look at, that we don't want to talk about. That makes people distrustful. That undermines scientific credibility. It does the opposite of what science and scientists claim to want.
There is in no way there could be any negative impact because of the vaccine. That's ludicrous.
No one has ever said that ever about any vaccine.
If you say that, then the question then becomes back for you to say, when COVID first got started, I invited so many doctors to come in to talk about COVID. And then I invited people from both sides. I want both sides. I invited people from both sides. You know which side would never come? The side that was for vaccine would never, ever come because they thought they were above the average person, that they know and the rest of us are dumb. So because of that, they're not willing to come and sit down with scientists. I think that's arrogant. So to me, when I ask you scientific debate, I'm not telling you I'm a scientist. Hey, let me debate with you because I'm smarter than you. I'm not a scientist. I'm a business guy.
Let's do a hypothetical scenario. Hypothetics are, let's assume an actual cause and effect has been established in this case.
Sure.
Which it's not have to see the film to know. I don't know that it.
Yeah. Quick bit of context in case you're jumping in on this video. Patrick Bet-David brought up the idea that prior to the COVID vaccine, a very, very small number, I think 20 some odd elite athletes in Europe had heart issues. And after the vaccine, on the order of thousands of athletes had reported severe heart issues. And one of the things that people are starting to see, and perhaps we're starting to build a bit of credible understanding on, is that it appears that the vaccine might implicate heart issues, particularly in younger, healthier populations. It seems to affect certain demographics differently than other demographics. The vaccine does. Again, this is not scientifically proven, but it's an interesting piece of data. And so Neil deGrasse Tyson is basically saying there's a temporal link there, meaning one happened after the other, but we haven't identified causation yet. They're correlated, which is fair. Skepticism is good. And that's what's kind of leading into this conversation.
A cause and effect other than a coincidence in time relative to other things that people might have been doing. By the way, alcohol consumption went up during COVID significantly. Okay, and alcohol is implicated in heart disease. So
depression, anxiety, people staying at home,
all
kids,
of the above. Opioid
addicts, addiction. Okay. So those staying at home.
So Neil deGrasse Tyson is pointing out, in fairness, as a scientist, these are a bunch of confounding variables. These are a bunch of elements that make it not easy to just draw a straight line A to B causation. This happened before, this happened after, therefore this is the cause that takes us from A to B. And he's right as a scientist. He should doubt. However, the same people who are, the same authority that says, look at all these confounding variables, are also people who are pushing for the vaccines and the mandates and the quarantine and the lockdown and saying basically there's no harm to these things. Except he just pointed out alcohol use goes up, likely abuse goes up, drug abuse goes up, addiction, depression, suicide, all of these social ills go up in an era of homeschooling and lockdowns and loss of employment due to vaccine mandates and all this other stuff. Yeah, bad stuff happens in the world, which is why we should be hesitant to institute things like lockdowns and mandates. They're not zero risk, zero cost choices for society.
Wasn't the best decision either.
What I'm saying is, if after the vaccine is available, more people die of heart failure over a time where alcohol consumption went up, as did depression.
That could be an option.
That's right.
That's a very good point.
That's all I'm saying here. But let's give it to you. that the vaccine caused this. Let's just say that, okay?
Yeah.
And add it all up, and you get, what was it, 1,500 post-vaccine?
29 to 1,500.
29 deaths.
29 sports deaths to 1,500.
Thousands of deaths,
Yeah.
let's say, okay? Let's say 10,000 even. Let's just do that, okay? All right. You can estimate how many deaths the vaccine saved during COVID, okay? Because you can look at the death numbers drop off as people got vaccinated. It's in the tens of millions. Again, you can make a decision. Do I not want to die from COVID at this rate that occurred in this world? Or do I not want to die from this complication from the vaccine itself, the heart failure? So make your decision. And so you'll say, I might be in that 1,500, so I'm not going to take. Then you get COVID and die from COVID, right? So you just make the decision.
You know what I would say to that?
This is where this conversation starts to break down, because the problem is there's lies, damn lies, and statistics. The problem is when you, in the modern discourse, when you try and have a conversation based on facts, objective facts, and you cite statistics, the problem is the data can be corrupted, can be twisted, can be manipulated. And there's 1,001 ways that that could happen. We could spend all of our lives chasing down rabbit holes looking for things. Here's an example. During COVID, certain doctors were instructed that if COVID was present, it should be marked as a cause of death. Not a contributing factor, but the cause of death. That's how we get quirky things. This is anecdotal, but it is illustrative of the larger point. An 18-year-old man dies in a motorcycle accident. He had COVID at the time that he died. COVID was listed as a cause of death. Now, maybe he coughed going through an intersection and laid his bike down. Who knows? We weren't there. But it's an example of how Neil deGrasse Tyson is referencing tens of millions of deaths. He's referencing in this conversation a 3% death rate. He's obfuscating the fact that that 3% is way out of line of what actually happened. It was one of the estimates. And further, that most of the deaths occurred in very old, very fat, very already sick populations. Patrick Bet-David is pointing out that these young, healthy people are having a negative downside from the vaccine, and they themselves hold very little risk to getting COVID and dying from COVID. It was very rare with younger people. And at the same time, the scientific establishment has now admitted, and frankly, if you've studied epidemiology, the study of disease transmission and origination, vaccines don't prevent transmission. What happens is, even with a good vaccine, even with a vaccine for something like, this happened recently, mumps. I think it went through the NHL. There was an outbreak of mumps. And mumps is a nasty virus, causes all sorts of trouble. Most of the symptomatic cases occurred in non-vaccinated players and staff, people from other countries perhaps, who didn't have as strong of a vaccination program. That happens. But there were plenty of people who were vaccinated who tested positive, but were asymptomatic. Because what the vaccine does is makes your case less severe. So what he's saying is, if you're a young, healthy person and you choose not to get the vaccine, you could die from COVID. That's like saying you could be struck by lightning. Statistically speaking, they're pretty comparable. But he's trying still to instill that fear, that idea that there's a generalized risk to COVID across the whole population. Because Mr. Read the Data is obfuscating the simple fact that the death rates, the severe risk rates of COVID are trenched very specifically and are heavily weighted towards certain portions of the population.
But you know what I would say to that?
What would you say?
Here's what I would say to that. I would say, perfect. Let me take the risk. And thank you for giving it to me that way versus telling me it's one or the other, which is how it was presented.
You are informed fully about what the risks are. But like I said, as a species, we're not very good at thinking statistically about it. We're just not. And when we want to, we believe we're going to be the exception. And look at the people betting on lotteries. You know, they think they're going to win.
But for me, like, you know, the moment they started saying you have to put on cigarettes, the risk of heart failure, cancer, this, that. And if you still want to smoke cigarettes, guess what? You got a risk if you smoke cigarettes. You may get lung cancer, right? Hey, if you eat this, if you do this, if you do that.
We've denied your admission to the bar. There's a cost to that because it's a public health issue. And so, right, you are free to smoke the cigarette, but not in my establishment, by law.
Not in your establishment.
By law.
By law.
Correct.
No problem.
Right.
Totally fine.
But that's an example.
But if you want to smoke cigarettes outside,
Neil,
you can.
And you can live on the beach unvaccinated, that's fine.
Neil, let me ask you this. So what state would you say was the most responsible during COVID?
State? I don't know. I never looked.
So if you're a stats guy. I have
no idea.
Okay, I'm a stats guy as well. I like stats, but I'm more financial. I'm not like, you know, I understand what you're saying.
A lot of stats and finance.
I'm a baseball guy, so I like stats.
Okay.
I'm all about stats. I love baseball. So if we look at the stats, the media made Florida seem the most irresponsible state. That's what the media made it look. Okay.
We're in Florida right now. You guys do have kind of a bad reputation on a lot of stuff.
Okay, sure. So, and by the way, I've lived in California 24 years, 5 years in Texas, 2 years in Florida.
Okay.
Just so you know my background.
That's right. Okay.
10 years in Iran, 2 years in Germany. That's kind of my background. A couple years in the military. But if we say, hey, if we look at the data, the most irresponsible state was Florida. You would have heard many times news telling you that. When I go to California and I would say,
as proof of this, they tried to give Ron DeSantis the nickname Death Santis as a way of saying he's so dangerous, he's so irresponsible, the people of Florida are suffering.
hey, I'm in Florida. I'm like, oh my God, you're in Florida. Oh my, it's horrible. But you know what I realized? Here's what I realized. If the state of Florida is so bad, why did the NBA during Black Lives Matter host the playoffs in Florida?
In the bubble.
If Florida
I thought they created a bubble for themselves.
But why did they come here? They could have done it in Texas. Texas got plenty of places they could do it. And why did they do it here?
I don't know.
But the point is, they felt safest.
Wait, I'm not going to use the NBA as a measure of what is
They also did the
I
Super
give you an
Bowl
idea.
here.
A lot of the Super Bowl was here. I'll give you another one. Pro-vaccine AOC for vacation. She came to Miami. People from New York and California were partying for Miami. During COVID, when everybody was looking for a home during Christmas where to go to, you couldn't go to Colorado. You couldn't go to Lake Tahoe because it sucked. You had all these other choices. Everybody came to Florida.
I'm not going to judge the safety of a... I can't use that as a statistics of safety. I can't. I don't care who chooses where to vacation. I care what your death rates are, what your vaccination...
And I want to give Neil deGrasse Tyson his due. He's saying, please make a fact-based argument, because as a scientist, I want to analyze the facts. That is proper training. That is what he should do. Anecdotes are emotionally resonant, but they are less useful as data points. That being said, anecdotes do speak to market behavior. In other words, the broad-based movement of lay people, of non-expert people. And there is a certain wisdom and sometimes a certain foolishness to that kind of crowd behavior.
Rates are, what your hospitalization rates are, that would be an objective measure from state to state. What state are you most likely to die in from COVID? That's a statistic I would pay attention to. What state has the least hospital beds to accommodate those who are sick from COVID, even if they're not going to die from COVID? I would want to know that. I'm not going to base a decision on whether the NBA chose to put their bubble in the state.
Well, statistically, New York and California does not look good. Statistically, New York and California, and they're supposed to be the most responsible ones. Those two states didn't look good. All I'm saying is, from my end, in a space where I sit there and I listen to you and I learn, I say, oh my gosh, okay, I had no clue about that. That was brilliant. That's interesting. Let me go research. Let me go look at this. I'm a guy that likes debate of experts in two different sides and let them make the argument. And I'm mature enough to know the better salesman doesn't necessarily have the better argument.
Good. But let me just say that there's nothing I've said in the last half hour that is a debating point. All I'm telling you, but you can debate whether you should still be able to work and put other workers at risk for not having vaccinated. You can debate that.
Yeah.
In the context of public health, that's a risk factor that we don't want to introduce to other people because of your decisions. That's a public health issue. It's been going on basically for 100 and something years since, you know, who's the woman who, some famous medical case, a person who spread, what is that case?
Recently?
No, 100 years ago.
Oh.
It created a whole wave
know who you're
of
talking
sanitation rules and things for public health sake.
I'm not familiar.
But anyway, the point is, I want to make sure you know you can focus on the 1,500 people who died after the vaccine.
Mary Mallon? You're talking about the history of typhoid fever?
Yeah, Typhoid Mary. Yes,
Yeah,
thank you.
Typhoid Mary.
By the way, everyone has a brain fart from time to time. Totally happens. Typhoid Mary. Makes sense. All right, let's see where we're going with this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I didn't know her last name.
Yeah.
I thought Typhoid was her first name.
Typhoid
was her
Mary.
last name. Okay. Wait. So it's simply a matter of, if you're saying you don't want to be in the 2,000, whatever the number is, who died after the vaccine from heart failure at the peak of your physical career, not totally necessarily factoring in all the other abuses that went on over that time that may have contributed to it. Instead, you want to take the risk of COVID and not be one of the 20 million people who would have died and didn't, right? So I just want you to have the statistics in front of you. And it seems to me most people would, in most cases, choose the path that reduces their chance of death.
But by the way, I don't
Here's the funny thing. He's got a point. And so it should be flummoxing to the experts. Why are people making such poor choices? This is their life that we're talking about. This is the risk. This is danger. Don't you want to choose the path that leads to not death? And then they look at people who are conflating the issue and confusing the issue and tossing in a bunch of irrelevant things, kind of the witch doctory, superstitious thinking. And they say, it's so frustrating that these people are talking about these things that confuse the non-experts and make them not adopt these wise, simple, normal, better choices. You're welcome to believe that. The challenge comes when you say, I want to use the force of government to silence those voices that don't agree with me. That is a very, very dangerous decision and not one to be taken lightly. But the experts in our society, scientists among them, are all too willing to control speech in order to push forward their own expertise point of view.
disagree.
That's why I'm not debating. I'm just saying, I'm putting it out there.
But this part of what you're saying, I'm 100% with you. But this is...
It's not a matter of being with me. It's just, are you with the decision-making of what is rational, statistical analysis?
But this position is not an arrogant position. This position is kind of like when you're sitting there and you tell the doctor, so doc, what do I do? Do I get the surgery? Like, we have one of my good friends right now is getting a brain surgery in the next couple of weeks. She's afraid. Now, she believes in God, so faith is kind of calming her down, but she's afraid, okay? The doctor says, there's a 10% chance you're not going to make it. Mm-hmm. Do you want to, for the rest of your life, live having to take that medication with the side effects, or do you want to do the surgery? The individual is making a decision to get the surgery. She knows the chances is what? 10%. You know what I say to that? Hey, at least I know the risk. Versus, no, if you take this, you won't get anything. Propaganda, selling me this. Like, what's the three things that you say? There's three different types of truth, right? It's objective truth, personal truth,
and political truth.
Exactly. Yeah. That's the one I have a problem with. And I agree with you.
Should we all?
And that's the part I have a problem.
And here's the crux of it. They're talking about certain types of truth, political truth being one of those. In other words, what is the set of facts or truth that is most useful for my political faction or for my political purposes? And the problem is, everyone has a bias. And I think Neil deGrasse Tyson is blind to his own bias, recognizing that he has been influenced to give him the credit, to give him benefit of the doubt. Perhaps he has inadvertently accepted certain political truths, and that has overridden what should be his trained scientific skepticism. That is the best benefit of the doubt that I can get. I would hate to think that he is intentionally trying to manipulate the public. But there are bad actors out there, and he sure seems to speak consistently. But here he's saying we should all be concerned about political truth. That's a good point, But what do your actions say?
Problem with. I'm personal truth. Let's debate. Have fun with it. Great. Let the audience.
Yeah. Personal truth.
Yeah.
You want to debate personal
Yeah,
truth.
exactly. That's cool.
Okay. Kirk or Picard,
Yes.
whatever.
Yes.
But is that a Star Trek reference?
Dude, who let him in?
I'm sorry.
Who let him in?
They've been asking that question for years.
The political truth,
let
I
him in
think,
the
is what brought a lot of division in households,
Of course
in
it will.
companies, different places.
Of course
I
it
think
will.
that's what happened the last 2.5 years,
Yeah.
specifically with that. And you know this, like, you took it, you didn't take it, you're part of a political party. Like, you may be positioning me right
Statistically,
now.
that was a correct statement.
Yeah, statistically it was. But what was interesting is that people with no college degrees took the vaccine less than those with bachelor's degrees, but then MBA was the least, which is kind of funny. MBA people took the least amount of vaccine
Interesting
percent.
sociological.
Yeah, interesting sociology statistics.
So what do we learn from all this? We spent over an hour on this conversation. What do we learn from this? Well, we learned that here in 2023, years and years after COVID first hit, and we should all be, you would think the science would be settled by now. We still have some major conversations that our country needs to have. We still have a major division within the country, and it does appear to break down upon, if not political, let's call it ideological lines. And if I was to try and encompass that in a way that's easy to grasp, there's an ideological group. There's a group of people who all believe a similar set of ideals. That's what I would call an ideological group. Okay. There are a group of people who believe that society has advanced by trusting on human expertise developed through rigorous study and disciplined thought and careful, meticulous planning, research, implementation, development, etc., of scientific methods and instruments, of drugs and disease analysis, etc., etc., and that society is better for it. And therefore, we would be foolish to turn our backs on that group that we have invested so much time and money and effort into developing their scientific expertise. And they're not wrong. They have some very, very valid points. That's absolutely true. The scientific establishment, to the extent that it practices good science, is one of the best things that we've done in the history of humanity. Just objectively speaking, it has extended our lives. It has improved the quality of our lives. It has made so many things better about living in this world. There's another ideological side that tilts towards the individual, towards the sovereignty of the self, towards the idea that each of us, assuming that we are fully grown adults, competent, functional, that we've had all the opportunity that we might want to gain education and expertise and knowledge and life experience, and therefore, hopefully, a measure of wisdom, that we are better as a society when individuals make free choices. When individuals choose freely, society as a whole benefits. And they are not wrong either, because the simple truth is, personal liberty leads to innovation. It leads to value. It leads to wealth creation. I mean, look at it this way. If we didn't have protection of intellectual property, do you really think people would waste and wear out decades of their lives trying to invent refrigeration, air conditioning, combustion motor, assembly line production, information technology? I mean, there's so many things that people sacrifice huge chunks of their lives in order to create that are so valuable, that benefit all of our lives. And if the individual didn't have the opportunity to benefit from that individual sacrifice that they freely went and chose to do, it wouldn't happen. There's a reason why communist Russia innovated almost nothing. Pretty much everything that they did was copying other people's innovations. That's why when it comes to military technology, one of the things that they spent the most money on, they were always behind the curve. I would argue the reason for that is because in such an authoritarian communist state, the individual has no incentive to sacrifice and to innovate. So society as a whole benefits when individuals are free to make their own choices. Now, some individuals suffer from that much freedom. Some individuals, if you give them plenty of freedom and plenty of money, will go drink themselves into a stupor and live under a bridge. Some individuals, if you give them almost no money, but you give them the freedom to think and act and work, will build multi-billion-dollar companies. It's happened, and it will happen again, thankfully. That is the reality of the human condition. If you allow humans individually to act, then you're going to get unequal outcomes. In the modern parlance, equity is the idea of equal outcomes. So individual market actors making their own choices based on their own wisdom lead to an inequitable society, a society where not everybody ends up with the same results or even close to the same results. Okay? I don't think that's a bad thing. But the people on the left are very convinced that that's a bad thing. That's why income inequality and wealth inequality and all of these things are talked about, because social justice is the idea of redressing the imbalances in society. The modern social justice movement rests on the idea that because society has a different outcome that can be viewed at a group level, therefore it must be racist. Because if society was not racist, the groups would be equal. That's what they're saying. It's nonsense. But they're passionate about it. That's a big part of what the conversation is about right now. So there are arguments that are valid on both sides of this ideological chasm. We need both sides. A healthy society carries tension between ideological groups. It is a bad idea to have a society where everyone is in one group. If everyone in a group embraces, and in a society embraces the same ideology, there's no pushback, there's no counterbalance. And if there's any flaw in that ideology, that society goes off the cliff because there's nothing to stop them. It is good for us to have competing, opposing political viewpoints. That's why I encourage rationalizing your own position and understanding the other person's position and arguing in good faith in an effort to try and persuade the other person and them to do the same to you, because both of you will end up stronger, both of you will end up better off for that, and you create a more vibrant civil society if we live in a society where we are allowed to have ideas in tension and to argue and debate and push back and forth on each other. Which is why I find it, you might say, unforgivable. Let's just say I cannot support. That's why I cannot support the idea of government censorship. The idea of using the force of law, which is essentially the force of violence or implied threatened violence, to silence speech and thought that doesn't agree with the medical establishment. Because what that's saying, as soon as you open that door and say that it is rational and right for the government, with its monopoly on force, to shut down certain viewpoints, what you're saying is, we have society, we have this ideological group and this ideological group, and they're under tension. But this one's right, so the government is going to squash this one, and off the cliff we go. That's the problem at its heart with COVID vaccines. That's the problem. This has been The Breakdown. Let me know what you think of it, and everyone, good luck out there.